All right, so welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and That's crazy. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. I'll learn my title one day. And I'm thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are reading On Revolution, uh, Hannah Arendt's last finished book, published in 1963. Uh, as some of you know, if I don't usually like to pick favorites, but it probably is my favorite book of Hannah Arendt's, um, along with Between Past and Future, which we read recently. Um, and we're just coming off uh, the conference, Joy, Loving the World in Dark Times, which was joyous and wonderful. And for all of you who made it out there, and I saw a lot of you there, it was great to see you. Um, and looking forward to continuing to read this book with you. If you'll recall, before the conference, we had two sessions on chapter 2 on the social question. Uh, it's a long chapter 2 is a long chapter, and we broke it into two. And just to remind us, Arendt is arguing in this book that um, revolution is important because it's the modern way in which we refound our political world. Revolution is a return, is a revolution back to the beginning, to first principles, but in a new way. It's not nostalgic for the past, but it does say our world is broken apart. Our world is corrupted. The freedom and the joy of our world is over in a sense, and we need to start it again. And revolution is the activity in which we are able to restart our world. And she says that uh, revolutions actualize the experience of being free. And it's this combination of experience of being free and of beginning something new, not a nostalgic return, but a return that initiates something new. That is the core of revolution. The social question is such an important factor for her, and it's the reason it's the longest chapter in the book, because the social question is in many ways the root of where modern revolutions go wrong. Right? Modern revolutions go wrong because they stop worrying about freedom. They stop aiming at freedom and instead aim at eradicating poverty, liberating ourselves from oppression. They aim at what John Rawls called social justice. And again, she's not against liberating ourselves from poverty or social justice, but she thinks that in important ways, um, if you want to actually found freedom, that's hard. And if you took your eyes off that ball and aim at social justice, at eradicating poverty, um, you go off. You go off the rails. And so she's comparing the American and French revolutions. The French Revolution started like the American Revolution as aiming at freedom, but very quickly became obsessed uh, with um, with attempting to give the people what they wanted, which was prosperity, the happiness of the people. And in so doing, they gave up on the dream of founding freedom. Um, Arendt, in the second half of the chapter, which we read in our last session, makes these incredibly interesting and I think complicated um, uh, distinctions between, on the one hand, compassion and pity, right? And she says that compassion I can feel for an individual, but pity I feel for a group, a group of people, a mass of people. And pity, she therefore says, is a perversion of compassion. Um, and she says that as a rule, pity does not set out to change the world. and ease human suffering. I just pity people. But if I do, out of pity, try and change the world and ease human suffering, because pity is such an intense emotion, it will shun, she says, the drawn out, wearisome process of persuasion, right? Because if you pity people who are suffering and oppressed, what are you going to tell them? Well, wait a couple decades and it'll get better, right? And that doesn't work. And so she says it will shun this wearisome process of persuasion, negotiation, and compromise, and lend voice to the suffering itself, which must claim for swift and direct action, that is, for action with the means of violence. And so the entrance of pity onto the scene leads to violence, leads to the terror in the French Revolution. Um, and she opposes pity to solidarity, right? Solidarity, she says, unlike pity, which is an emotion that seeks solidarity with the poor, seeks affinity with the poor and to help the poor. Solidarity, she says, seeks to attend to all men, not just the poor, the rich like the poor, and thus seeks to articulate a group interest that encompasses the rich and the poor in a country, or all men, or the humanity, or as she says, the grandeur of man and dignity of man. Um, and so for her, solidarity is this principle that can inspire and guide action, um, that seeks to bring all people together, not just the oppressed. And this idea of solidarity is, I think, one of the more fascinating ideas in Arendt. I think it is actually central to Arendt's political thinking. Her idea that we can find a common world in which, even though we're different and plural, we can be united, is, I think, an idea of solidarity in this sense. And just a quick public service announcement. Our conference next year, which will be on October 15th through the 17th, is going to be on solidarity. So I'm excited you're the first people to hear that, and I'm excited to let you know. The point for her is that liberation from poverty and happiness of the people became the exclusive aims of the French Revolution. And once this happens, that sentiment is boundless and everything is permitted in the revolutionary direction. All right, so that was why the social question was so important, and why we spent so much time on it. Chapter 3, which is what we're reading today, which is one of the shorter chapters in the book, is actually still quite important, and it articulates one of Arendt's central ideas, right? That she's developed in all of her work, but that I think is given the height of its flourishing here in her work, which is that what makes life meaningful for human beings is to be free. Free not as having free will, free not as having civil liberties, but free in the sense of being able to act and speak in public in ways that matter, as she already articulated what she understood as the right to have rights in chapter 9 of The Origins of Totalitarianism. Freedom in the sense of acting collectively, to act in concert with others, as she puts it in What is Freedom? Freedom in the sense of to participate in government, in self-government, to have that human dignity. That is what it means to be a human for Arendt, because that is what allows us to act in public and to be remembered, to gain the kind of immortality that she talks about as the core of human essence in the introduction to the human condition. And so the pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of human meaningfulness in public and political life. In this chapter, she's using the pursuit of happiness, which of course is a quotation from the Declaration of Independence, right? Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence changes John Locke's life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Arendt is here going to, on the one hand, claim that what Jefferson tried to mean, or at least one part of what he wanted to mean, was to claim for the American people, the Declaration of Independence, a kind of aspiration to this public happiness. But she says he never articulated it clearly, and the founders never articulated it clearly, except for one. The one person who really gets this is John Adams. Um, and and what she says is that the pursuit of happiness ended up being ambiguous. It meant two things. On the one hand, it meant the pursuit of public happiness. And on the other hand, it meant what most people think of it as the pursuit of private happiness, both civil liberties, but also the right to, be at home in your family. In a sense, a little bit what, if you were at the conference or saw the conference, what Teju Cole talked about as Operation Lightness, the the happiness and joy one feels with one's family, with a beautiful book, with things that make you happy and contented in some way. Um, and Arendt thinks that in the end, the American Revolution both founded freedom because it was committed to and dedicated to public happiness, but immediately that freedom became frustrated and subject to loss because there was another idea of happiness that was also core to America, which was abundance, the land of milk and honey. And she says that in America, the social question comes back, right? So chapter 2 about the social question says that America largely avoided the social question because they didn't realize there was poverty or at least misery in America, except for slavery, which they didn't see in an important way. But she says in chapter 3 here at the end that the social question comes back not in the question of poverty, but in this idea of the American dream, the idea of the desire to make money, the idea that America was a land of freedom and the pursuit of happiness, both in the sense of Republican freedom and participation in government, and in the sense of I can rise myself up and make money and become wealthy. And she says that these two strains of happiness, public and private happiness, are in eternal tension in America. And the great danger to American republicanism, to the republic idea of America, the idea of America as a republic, the great danger to that is that public happiness is lost and is overwhelmed by the drive for private happiness. She begins the chapter, right, by talking about what she means by a revolutionary situation. A revolutionary situation is when the power and authority of the existing government have been lost. And on the one hand, she says that, the authority of a government is only truly lost when the institutions of the government no longer obey it. The army no longer obeys it. The bureaucracy no longer obeys it. And when that happens, revolutions are pretty easy because there's no resistance. They happen swiftly and easily, she says on page 107 of the edition most of you use, or 112 in the first edition. She makes a similar point about this, if you're interested at all, in an interview she gives at the end, that's published in a couple places, but most accessibly in the end of the book Crises of Authority. Um, and in that book on page 205, she says that the loss of power and authority by all great powers, and she's here speaking in the early 1970s, she's saying, look, there's a crisis of authority in the 1970s, and the loss of power and authority is visible, um, even amidst the immense accumulation of violence and the means of violence and technology by modern governments. But even that technology that the governments have can't cover over the loss of power. And what she means by that is that people no longer believe that the governments represent them. They no longer believe that the governments are republics in the sense of we act and govern ourselves. And once that happened, the governments lose their legitimacy. This doesn't lead necessarily to a revolution, right? She's very clear about that. It could lead to a revolution. It could also lead to a counter revolution, a dictator or a demagogue emerging. Um, and it can also, of course, just go on in that situation for decades and decades, maybe even a century, because no one's able, whether it's a dictator or a revolutionary, to figure out how to pick up the power that has been dropped by the government that's sitting there and lying in the streets. Um, and Arendt really does believe that the great question of revolutions is how to pick up the power. She says on page 107, which is page 112 again in the first edition, she says, not all revolutionary situations lead to revolutions because you need men who know how to pick up the power. And that is an intellectual project. We have to, and that's what Arendt means, I think, by solidarity, as I was mentioning it before. To pick up the power in a revolutionary sense, you need to create a solidarity. But you need to do that. You need to be able to speak to the whole people, whether it's the people of France or the people of America or the people of the world, whoever you're speaking to. You need to articulate ideas and principles that gather the people into one. And that means you need to talk to people and you need to seek to find what is an idea that all the people, amidst their plurality and differences, and not try and convince them that you're right all the time. What can unite us? And that's for her what a revolution requires, that kind of discovery of solidarity. So with that in mind, she says, let's turn to the men of the revolutions. And she looks here both at the men of the American Revolution and the men of the French Revolution, right? And she wants to say that what united both the French and the American revolutionaries was a passionate concern for public freedom. She says, who starts a revolution, right? It's not the poor that start a revolution. I mean, no revolution has ever been started by the poor. Revolutions are started by um, uh, usually, elites. Um, and in this case, in America, they were started by these founders who often were in government already or law, and certainly were not the poor. Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, etc. And in France, they were started originally by what she calls these hommes de lettres, the men of letters. But they were, and what if they all cared about public freedom, they were different. She says that the American revolutionaries had an experience of freedom because already in America they were in government. They shared in the public business. They were engaged in politics, and as they started the revolution and they got more engaged in politics, they found that they loved it, and so they had this experience of it. The hommes de lettres, the men of letters, in France, were different. They didn't have the experience of public freedom, but they had a taste for it, she says. They sought recognition not in happiness of deliberation, but in the applause of the crowd on page 111. They spoke of republicanism more intellectually than in America. I mean, the American revolutionaries, she says, acted the French revolutionaries were writing and thinking. Um, and they didn't have the experience. They were withdrawn from society. They were people who were in the courts and the salons. They educated themselves in seclusion. And this is a big difference amongst the men of the revolution. Um, that she imagines. Um, one thing this leads to is that when they came to actually be involved in the revolution, um, the French revolutionaries uh, quickly gave up on the idea of public happiness as a goal. They started a constitution with the tennis court oath, but it failed. They cut themselves off from the people, and they immediately assumed the role of intellectuals or bureaucrats, of experts who would help give the people what they want. The French came to see it as their job to provide liberty and and money and support to the people. Whereas the Americans, she thought, because they were consumed with this experience of deliberating and actually participating, um, were less concerned about giving people the outcome, liberties or money or satisfaction of the needs or welfare, and more concerned with institutions that would protect this right or aspect of deliberation. Um, and thus the Americans were consumed with constitutionalism, with laying down the boundaries of a new political realm and defining the rules within it, of building a new political space for the pursuit of this new thing that they had come to experience and love, public happiness. And she thinks they did that through a constitution in which they created the separation of powers and deliberative bodies. But she says that constitution is not enough to found freedom. The second task on page 117 is to found and build this new political space for public freedom and public happiness so that the revolutionary spirit could survive the end of the revolution. Because at some point, the revolution will end. And how do you keep that public spirit alive, that experience of freedom? And she says the American success in founding freedom was frustrated from the beginning. This is really the core of her turning point of her argument here. It's on 117 or 122 to 123 in the first edition. The American success in founding freedom was frustrated from the beginning, she says, because it failed in the second task of assuring the survival of the spirit out of which the foundation sprang, namely public happiness. It's only in the last chapter, in chapter 6, when she starts talking about the ward systems, that she's going to be very specific about how she thinks the Constitution could have been written to not fail, to provide a space for public freedom. But here she's simply saying it didn't do it, and it did fail. And she says that a hint of why it failed and a foreshadowing of why it failed was the very term, the pursuit of happiness, that Thomas Jefferson inserted into the Declaration of Independence. Right? So he uses this formula, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And she says it's interesting because in the Virginia Convention of 1774, so just written 2 years earlier, he wrote that our ancestors, when they left Britain, exercised a right to which nature has given all men of establishing new societies under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness. So 2 years earlier, he wrote public happiness. And she's like, why did he write just happiness in the Declaration? Well, we'll never know. There's no record as far as she could find, and certainly I've never seen anyone find it, as to why the change. I mean, maybe he just thought it sounded better. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of public happiness. But for her, Jefferson's true notion of happiness was clearly public happiness. And she cites this amazing um, letter that he writes to John Adams, um, I think in 1814, but I could be wrong. But we have to remember that Jefferson and Adams were wild political enemies, right? I mean, um, when Adams lost to Jefferson in the election for president, he left town before Jefferson even got there. They didn't talk to each other. But they reconciled and they actually became friends at the end of their life. And at the end of their lives, Jefferson writes to Adams that uh, may we meet again, right? In Congress when we die with our ancient colleagues. And Arendt says that this is extraordinary, right? I mean, the classic idea of a kind of bliss from the Christian idea of eternal joy from Aquinas is the joy in solitary vision of God, or Heidegger even in the standing in the clearing with being, me alone, right? um, the entire history of Western political thought of has this idea of joy as my joy with God, my joy with being, my joy alone in a contemplation of the eternal. And what Jefferson had, Arendt thinks, and I think she's right, and what the founders had was this idea of joy as being in Congress with others, literally in Congress with others. And and in this sense, she says that even though he wrote The Pursuit of Happiness, he blurred public happiness and private happiness, and and that there's a shift here that then happens where public happiness means freedom in the sense of participation, uh, whereas private happiness means civil liberty, being left alone, given certain rights, and also abundance or welfare. Um, and it's this slippage that she sees as the beginning of the corruption of the American Republic as a republic. Um, the big question, right? And she frames it as the question on page 129 or 134 to 135 in my edition, the first edition, but 129 in most of your editions. She says the big question is, okay, America succeeded in founding freedom. Did the foundation of freedom in America create what she calls a granite groundwork capable of withstanding the futile antics of society intent upon affluence and consumption, right? Did we create a republic that has institutions of public happiness so strong that they'll resist people's desire for simply private liberties, affluence, and consumption? And she says, as of today, she says there exist signs to justify hope and signs to instill fear, right? And that's sort of where she leaves us. She ends the chapter by saying that, in a sense, if in chapter 2, she says that America, in some sense, benefited from the invisibility of the social question, unfortunately, the social question comes back, not as a question of poverty, but as a question of abundance. Insofar as America is seen as not only a land of political freedom, but of a land of milk and honey, a land to pursue your dreams, to make money. Um, the American dream of a promised land where milk and honey flow, uh, in a sense, always threatens to overwhelm and destroy the focus on public freedom that we have at our core as a republic and in our Republican tradition. And so that's how the chapter ends. Um, and it leads into chapters 4 and 5 on Foundation 1 and Foundation 2, in which she tries to talk about what is the granite core, right? What is um, the foundation of the republic that can or may not resist the corrosion and corruption of the social question and the land of milk and honey. All right. Uh, that's I think you'll see, I hope you'll see, I hope you see that this chapter is so important because in many ways, it lays out Arendt's really core idea of politics as about public freedom. And in the context of the book and the history of America, lays out both the exceptionalism, in her view, of the American Republican Revolution, but also the way in which it's not exceptional and the way in which it is subject to the same or at least related social concerns that could destroy it that she sees in other revolutions in other countries around the world. Okay. I look forward to the conversation. You can engage in the chat up through the chat, and please be civil to each other, but enjoy the conversation. You can also go down to the little react button and hit raise hand, and I will call on you in the order in which you do that, and we can have our conversation here. I look forward to it. Haley, you're up first.
Hiya, thanks, Roger. I please bear with me because I'm trying to hopefully articulate what it's making me think of in a way that everybody understands. It's just making me think that Arendt is like her own version of Aristotle, and there's just something here around, I don't know, it's just around morality and maybe virtue ethics and things like that. But I know that that's not what she was interested in and not what she ever wanted to do. So like the concept of a common good, I think for Arendt just that wasn't what she wanted or intended, or she didn't like that idea because that goes against plurality. um but then like thinking about like what unites us and like this kind of like searching for principles that we all agree on and that we can all kind of get on board with. So then I'm thinking, well, freedom now, or the pursuit of freedom, that does sound like a common good. And yeah, so that's kind of what I was thinking. And then I was thinking then about how Jefferson, he didn't say put the pursuit of public happiness in the end. And I'm just thinking, wow, maybe it's, I mean, maybe they all had a conversation about it and thought it sounded like too much like a common good, and that everyone was going to kick back against that and say, mind your business, my happiness is what I want it to be. You don't get to say that. And yeah, so those are my ramblings. Like, it'd be interesting to know if I'm onto something or what you think, Roger. Thanks.
Thanks, Haley. No, it's a great question. On the question of Jefferson, my impression is that she looked to see if there was discussion about this and didn't find it. I'm not, she doesn't, if someone knows about this discussion, I would love to learn about it. But my impression is that he just wrote Pursuit of Happiness and people took it as they meant it, as they thought it. Some people probably took it as public happiness. Some people took it as private happiness. And it was, and as she says, it may have just been his famed felicity of the pen, that he was a great writer and he wrote it and people went with it and didn't think too much about it. But we don't know, or at least I don't know. The core of your question about Aristotle is I think an excellent one. Because I do think, and I mean, this is no secret, Arendt is profoundly Aristotelian. Um, uh, which is not to say that she's the same as Aristotle, but she certainly agrees with Aristotle about many things. Um, and one of the uh, core ideas in Aristotle is his disagreement with Plato about the many and the one, right? Whereas Plato wants a philosopher king to rule and state the truth, and Plato wants there to be one good and one truth. Uh, Aristotle dissents from Plato in the Politics and says against, he says specifically, Plato says we should all have one, and there should be, one common truth, and we should have wives and children in common, and we should have communism, right? And he says, no, no, that's not good because the people is a plurality. The people is many, Aristotle says. And so the goal is not to make of the many one, Aristotle says. It's to gather the many around and show them what unites them amidst their differences, and not try and do away with their differences. And so it's that, and so and it's for that reason, right? This is, part of the thesis of the book that I'm going to be publishing soon, called The World We Share, about friendship. But it's part of the reason that why Aristotle then says that friendship is the bond of the polis, right? Friendship is what holds the polis together, because unlike truth, which says that we all have to have the same truth and be the same, friendship says we can be part of the same polis even if we don't agree. And Aristotle thus, sets friendship as the core of politics, and Arendt does as well. And while her idea of friendship certainly moves beyond Aristotle and as much, she adds a lot to it, it starts there. And so I think you're right that the common good, or virtue of the people, of the polis, is freedom for Arendt. The freedom to both build the world together, to act together, to public happiness, which also then gives us a certain amount of liberty or private happiness to pursue our own ideas of the good in a liberal sense. And so I don't think the common good, as Arendt and Aristotle understand it, is against plurality. I guess that's where I would push back against your question, Haley, a little bit, because I think, at least as Aristotle and Arendt understand it, unlike Plato, right? The common good is about finding what we share and also admitting and allowing for our differences. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Neil.
Hi, Roger. A couple of weeks ago, I went out to coffee with a friend of mine, told her how excited I was to be reading On Revolution and, with this group. And then so she'd never seen the book. I handed it to her. She thumbed through it, opened it to chapter 3, and read the first sentence to me. And it's 97 words. Said, "What does that mean?" And I read it and I said, well, thankfully there's a discussion group and I can ask the discussion leader, because I think it's got 7 dependent clauses and 97 words and I couldn't parse it.
Yeah. I want to really start, first of all, it was great to see you last week. Great question. I was teaching John Stuart Mill this week, and I had a student read a sentence in class that took 2 minutes to read. And I said, don't write like this. And the interesting thing about Hannah Arendt in this regard is that, like Nietzsche in a certain way, she can be an epigrammatic thinker, right? She can write very powerful short sentences that we remember, right? And then sometimes she writes sentences like this that remind us that English was her 5th language. And it's one of the things that can be so frustrating, because she can be so clear and so powerful and then so unclear and so imprecise. And you sometimes just have to shake your head. So let's read this tongue twister. Necessity and violence. Violence justified and glorified because it acts in the cause of necessity. So she's saying necessity and violence, right? Which have been the 2 themes of the previous chapter, that the social question brings necessity as opposed to freedom to the fore. And that when it does so, it dispenses with persuasion, which takes so long, since necessity can't wait for persuasion. and it involves violence. So necessity and violence, right? Violence justified and glorified by necessity, because if you have necessity, you got to do violence. Necessity no longer either rebelled against in a supreme effort of liberation. So we don't rebel against necessity in order to free ourselves from it, to liberate ourselves from it. Basically, the idea here is that throughout history, we've rebelled against necessity, right? I mean, people are like, I don't want to work. I mean, who wants to labor, right? To be able to eat. And so we sort of, it's natural to want to free ourselves from labor. And so she thinks that's fine. It's totally natural to want to free yourself from labor and free yourself from necessity. But the necessity she's talking about is different. Because remember, what she said in the social question chapter is that what the great insight of Marx, which she thinks is a great negative, the great mistake Marx made, is to say that poverty, oppression, and necessity are political, namely that they can be overcome. And she's like, no, right? There's always going to be inequality. There's always going to be richer and poorer. And so to say that, so necessity in the old sense, right, as that can be rebelled against and liberated from is one thing. But on the contrary, we now have this new sense of necessity, faithfully worshipped as the great all-coercing force, which surely, in the words of Rousseau, will force men to be free. That we now have to, in a sense, remake men. We have to force them to share our opinion, force them to be free, right? If they don't become free themselves, we have to force them. And so necessity is not just seeking to be free from, the labor that we have to do in order to eat. It's now the forcing and violent forcing of men to have to be part of the people in the French sense, to be part of one coherent social entity. And she says, we know how these two and the interplay between them have become the hallmark of successful revolutions, namely in that they lead to terror and violence. So it's a brutally awful sentence. There's no defense I can make of it, except to say that she'll say the same thing in much clearer ways throughout the chapter. But yeah, you're right. It's one of those things that sort of baffles me about Arendt, is that at times she's so powerfully brilliant as a writer and sometimes so bad as a writer.
Okay, well, I get it better now. Thank you.
Yep. Hannah.
Well, in lieu of what Neil was saying, I have to say I had just the most wonderful experience with AI, which, Roger, when you're not available, I find extremely helpful sometimes with Arendt. Because I was feeling like it was like a mental tongue twister, a mental mind twister with the civil versus public liberties and private versus public happiness. And I was not keeping them straight. So I went to AI and I asked a very lazy question to begin with. It was the wrong question. I knew it was, but I was just sort of half thinking. And then I improved the question. But first I said, in the chapter on the pursuit of happiness in Arendt's book on revolution, it seems to make much of little differences, which was a very bad question. And it took me to task in such a wonderful way. It said that in On Revolution, Hannah Arendt's focus on the little differences in the chapter on the pursuit of happiness is central to her broader comparison of the American and French revolutions. Her detailed analysis of the subtle and not so subtle shifts in meaning between private happiness and public happiness reveals what she sees as a fundamental fork in the road for modern political life. And then it goes on to make key distinctions. And I said to my husband, I said, well, I wasn't really, I understood that much, but what I was getting confused about was civil versus public liberties. So then I narrowed it down to that, and it completely cleared it up for me. So I'm saying it's just sometimes a really good tool. It might destroy life as we know it and destroy our civilization, but it sure can be a helpful tool when you're, getting through a lot of concepts and terms. So that was one thing. I adored uh, really adored the quote that you did that I was struck by on the granite groundwork, capable of withstanding the futile antics of a society intent upon affluence and consumption, or whether it will yield under the pressure of wealth, as the European communities have yielded under the pressure of wretchedness and misfortune. So I find a little confusion between past and present with her reference to Europe. Do you think she's alluding in the present to its turn towards socialism? Just wondering, versus just, going to the past, because she's putting it more in the present. If you know, because she's talking about our turn towards affluence and consumption.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. I got it. Thanks.
And
It's a
so-
good question, Hannah.
And the final thing I want to say, just to say, is I didn't know what sempiternal meant. So I looked it up, and do you know the dictionary says it's really a redundant term? It's probably never going to be used again, but I'm not sure. But I thought that was interesting.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I guess I should at least thank you that you still come to the group, even though you could just hang out at AI all the time.
I know, isn't it
So,
amazing?
Um,
Just kidding. I could never do it without you.
well, I mean, maybe
I
don't say
couldn't even
never.
open the book without you.
Never say never. I am not one person who's a Luddite. I use AI regularly. I think it has a lot of, at this point, it's a great tool. There are people who say that it's not going to be a tool, it's going to replace us. And,
Right.
it's not there yet. But it is a good tool. On the question of, on page 129, this quote about, how will political freedom vanish in America? Obviously, I think a question that many of us are worried about in the present moment.
For sure.
What she's suggesting here about in the comparison to European communities, and it's one of these small differences that you were mentioning, Hannah. It's just that the social question in Europe has largely been a question of poverty, and as you said, it in its modern manifestation through social democracy and the welfare state.
Okay.
In the United States, we have some welfare, but we don't have nearly the same kind of welfare state as they do in Europe. There's not the social question, is there. I mean, we debate things like Social Security and health care, medical care, and Obamacare, and things like that. But
do nothing about it. Do you
but it's
know
at a
that-
much lower level, right? And it doesn't, in her mind, it doesn't drive the discourse
Okay.
that would threaten public liberty.
Okay.
What drives the discourse in America, she thinks, is the dream of abundance. The dream that, we can either rise ourselves out of poverty to having the 2 cars, 2 children in a suburban lawn, or we can rise out of the 2 cars and 2 children in the suburban lawn to, the private island.
Right.
And this dream of milk and honey, of sort of abundance, is for her, where the social question appears in America. So what she's saying here is, the social question exists in both Europe and America, but in a different way.
Yeah, I understood that. I just wondered if she did mean socialism and you were verifying that. I have to say one thing finally. You know, the other day they came out with the report that now the average family of four is faced with $27,000 for health care. And I Googled Korea, for example. I just wondered what it costs. It's about 4,000. And I think what it's showing is that we have reached an utterly insupportable point uh, 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 in terms of what she's talking about. Um, and it's
Yeah.
very, very relevant to everything we are going through.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not an expert in healthcare, so I'll let your view stay. I don't know. Kathy.
Hi. So I've sort of had the same question in every chapter, and it has evolved along with the complexity of the chapters. And that is, Hannah Arendt gets it about slavery and understands why people didn't see the desperation in the situation of enslaved people. But she never, or at least there's one oblique reference, but she never addresses the theft of land, which even more than slavery was the basis of plenty and the basis of this dream of milk and honey and the American dream. And, you know, what was at first a windfall of timber and farmable land and became the extraction economy that we have today. And so I have wondered whether she writes about that in another place because it seems so overwhelmingly relevant today to people's view of, you know, the American dream and the right, and also the conflict with the right wing. Do we have the right to exploit on this level or not? And what does that mean about the definition of public happiness? Like, is how tied happiness is in part of the American psyche to exploitation of all kinds, but particularly the earth. And now that we're reaching a crisis of that, including driven by AI at the moment, it's it's interesting. It's an interesting opportunity to bring forth in the public discourse the issue of public happiness because this is a very public issue. So yeah.
Just so I understand, Kathy, are you talking about the taking of the land from the Native American inhabitants, or are you talking about just general extraction of things from the land?
Well, it started, I mean, the theft of Native American, the United States was populated when the Europeans came, pretty much everywhere. And there was, you know, nations that set up and they had intercourse between each other, etc. And they destroyed that and took the land that belonged to these Native American nations without, you know, a fair negotiation. And that I saw that as the beginning of this treatment. Like Washington, even before the revolution, said, our goal here is to reach the West Coast. And because the land will support a growing population and a vibrant polis. And it was so tied to that concept of we need this abundant wealth here to make this thing work.
Yeah. You know, for her, in many ways, the essence of capitalism is not profit but consumption, right? She makes this claim in the last chapter on labor in the human condition. She hints at it here on pages 118 to 120 in her discussions of what she calls the American ideology of of private happiness, which she calls a delusion, a terrible delusion, um, um, of ghastly privilege of pursuing a phantom and embracing a delusion, citing someone named Howard Mumford Jones, who I have to admit I don't know who that is. Um, uh, so she definitely um uh has a critique of uh of consumption, and she thinks that, as I was saying before in my answer to Hannah, um she thinks that the American dream of plenty, of abundance, um is what in a sense crowds out the Republican tradition. um uh and so you could certain there she does certainly have um a critique of consumptive capitalism, that runs throughout her work. um but it is important, I think, at least to add a caveat to that, that she also has a critique of socialism, right? Which and she thinks both um socialism and capitalism lead to oppression. One, the oppression of a bureaucratic government, and one, the oppression of um, consumptive corporations. But so she sees them as both dangerous and both needing to be resisted. But yes, there's definitely a critique of consumption in here. I mean, it's the it's the road that the American founders, in her view, almost and should have avoided, but in the end left it open and has become, the alternative that could ruin the Republican tradition, in her view. Maybe I don't know if I got your question, but that's how I at least was trying to understand it. Is that helpful?
It's helpful, and I still have, part of my question is really tied also to thinking about the next chapters in the book, about what the way forward is. So I'll hold my question the rest
All
of
right.
it.
Thanks, Kathy. Steve Maslow, how are you doing?
Thank God, I'm very well.
Good.
First thing I want to say is that, in the words of my 31-year-old son, the conference was the bomb. It was absolutely marvelous. I have afterglow. So thank you for your leadership about that.
Well, thank you, and thanks for leading that tour to the gravesite and saying the Kaddish. I unfortunately didn't catch that, but I heard it was fantastic. So
Glad.
thank you.
My pleasure. So I just wanted to very quickly point out something that struck me in the third chapter when this is the second time I'm reading the book, so that struck me this time that I missed, I guess, the first time, which is the tremendous, whereas the second chapter, the emphasis is on necessity and violence, which seem like action, but they're not, according to her. And somewhere else, and I can't remember where, Hannah Arendt defines political, she says, in politics, saying the right words at the right time is action. So with that in mind, I was very struck by Hannah Arendt's contempt for intellectuals, that it's not even subtle. She uses that term. And she contrasts intellectuals with men of letters, um, which I won't even try to pronounce in French. And she criticizes intellectuals because they use words that they borrow from literature, and she uses the Latin term odium to describe them, which I think I would translate as a kind of laziness or boredom, as opposed to the men of letters, which chose their words because they describe their experiences, and she uses the Greek term skole to describe. I was just thunderstruck by that when I read it, because if I do understand that she is very Aristotelian, and one of Aristotle's two definitions of man is that he or she is a creature of speech. And I mean, I get that, but I know of nowhere else, and I'd be happy to be corrected, where she lashes out at intellectuals like this and people who use words that aren't backed by experience. It would, I don't know, just for someone as scholarly and as erudite as Hannah Arendt, to lash out like this, I just don't know what's going on there or what prompted this, but it was, psychologically speaking, a departure from other things that I've read by her, and very, very interesting, I thought.
Yeah.
So I'm just sharing that.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, for Steve was at the beginning of the Arendt Center, and he's come back, but he's missed some of the reading groups that we've done where we've read her on intellectuals. And I've actually published a fair bit on her relation to intellectuals. Hannah Arendt has a lifelong disdain for intellectuals. She writes often to Karl Jaspers and others that she never wanted to become a professional thinker or an intellectual, as she put it. She says in On Violence that the greatest threat to the American Republic and to freedom in the modern world is the entry of intellectuals into government. Um, uh, there's a whole there's a number of different sources of her disdain for intellectuals. One is the behavior of many intellectuals during Nazism and the Third Reich. She came to believe that there was a professional deformity to people who spent their lives thinking, reasoning. One is it took them away from reality, from suffering, from real people and the real world, and it allowed them to justify what they were doing through rationalizations and arguments. And she came to believe that this was an endemic threat and something that endangered anyone who spent their lives amongst ideas. And obviously not everyone succumbed to it, but it was a danger, and she became deeply aware of it, and has a fear of intellectuals that runs through her entire life's work. The other the other sort of foundational source of her fear of intellectuals is the Platonic reaction to the death of Socrates, right? So Plato's reaction to the death of Socrates, as Arendt understands it, is to say the many and their opinions are dangerous, and we need to turn away from politics in which we listen to the many and be ruled by a philosopher king who knows the correct truth. And she traces this Platonic disdain for politics and the replacement of politics by intellectually generated reason as the line from Plato to Marx, and the Marxist effort to in a sense impose an intellectual plan, the dialectic, on society through a bunch of intellectual avant-garde experts. And then it has its further development through the rise of bureaucracy in the bad sense of a technocracy that will govern the people,
Ruled by no one.
ruled by nobody. Yes, the rule of nobody. And so Arendt has a long-standing critique of and fear of intellectuals. In this particular case, she she's discussing two groups of people. One, the American founders, who were certainly not poor, but were not intellectuals either. They were, they were lawyers and business people but people who were also often quite active in public affairs. And she talks about them as having the experience of politics. And the other is these men of letters, the hommes de lettres. I don't know how to pronounce it either. Um, who, who were sort of well off, again, not poor, but not, but they withdrew from society in a way, and thus they didn't have the intellectuals' desire to impose their views and their insights on society. Um, and so yeah, she's very clear that these men of letters are quite different from and above intellectuals. The problem with the French Revolution is that the men of letters transformed into intellectuals in the sense that when they left their seclusion, they didn't become men of experience who wanted to bring everyone into action. They became intellectuals who wanted to then impose uh, their superior knowledge on the rest of society, and that was her problem with them.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you. It's been a while.
This is my first time attending a virtual meeting, but the topic is fascinating. And the comments regarding intellectuals, maybe I'm afraid of being here since I'm kind of a person who maybe fears intellectuals. So a little bit of my background. I'm a lawyer. I do civil rights law, and I also served a couple tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been living in a lot of places in the world, and I just think Hannah Arendt, this concept of people deciding things at the lowest level and having a decision making there. I'm trying to draft an article or maybe even a book on the right to petition government for redress, and one of the topics here is exactly what does the pursuit of happiness mean. And to me, I go back to what I think biology says and people's tribal instincts. So I think it's both personal economics, what's needed for your health and safety of yourself and your family and your economics, and also to be able to communicate to your leaders, the tribal leaders, or I think the founders when they wrote the right to petition government, including the Declaration of Independence. It's that the people not only to protect their own interests and whatnot have the right to appeal to their governors. So I view the concept of happiness as both private and public, and that's my thought on the subject.
Well, Michael, it's perfect because you're a true American. And that's what she says. She says that in America, in essence, America is split, right? It's both public and private happiness. And that in a sense, the ambiguity in the Jeffersonian presentation of it is actually true to America. She worries though that that in the end the private happiness, the pursuit of abundance, or as you said, biology and life forces, the will overwhelm the right to petition and appeal and public happiness, and that's her worry. She says, I don't know if it's true, and as she said there, we don't know yet, and we still don't know yet. But that's the worry that she's engaged in. And have we created enough of a granite foundation to protect public happiness, which is always going to be, less obviously clear to people than private happiness.
If I could just add one more thing, I think the concept is so foundational that, for example, when I was in Afghanistan dealing with tribal people and some non-tribal, but they were interested in their own interests, but they actually were looking at the broader tribal interests too. And what they wanted was to be able to deal with the government. And the reason the Taliban was able to be successful was they did address the needs of people trying to petition government for redress. So I think it's really foundational what Hannah Arendt, his concept here, and I think it's great, this program you have, and I'm happy to have attended today.
Great, thank you, and welcome. Hopefully see you again. Bernie.
I think all the way back to taking a political ideas class as an undergraduate, when we're addressing the Declaration of Independence, the explanation for why is that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, in the Declaration, was kind of regarded as pretty straightforward. That the fact that he was borrowing off of Locke, and that the primordial rights are life, liberty, and property, that Jefferson, whose riches and fine living standards was accomplished through enslavement. Well, obviously it couldn't, as he's going to have this trio of inalienable rights that inhere in every single human being everywhere. Well, certainly that could not include property. So what was he going to trade it out with? Well, okay, well, we won't trade it out for happiness, because a lot of people will live and die having never attained that. But we'll put in a right and an inalienable one to at least pursue some form of happiness. And I haven't, heard any aspect of this coming out of Arendt or your exegesis of Arendt. So I want to just put that on the table for any comments you might have about that. The other thing, I've, in our smaller dialogue group, I brought up the issue of FDR's Four Freedoms speech, which was, State of the Union address to Congress in, I think, 1941, where freedom from want, at least FDR thought, the inability or the inadequacies of supplying the wants, and he's really talking about the physical needs of the many, as a very important aspect of freedom. And at least it seems that Arendt is arguing against that. No, freedom is something really for a special crew of humans toward the top. And we can't be too distracted by the needs of the many towards the bottom. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on both those things.
Thanks, Bernie. On the first, you can look at the change that Jefferson brings about from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and say, oh, well, there's no change. It's the same thing. Or I guess you can look at it and say, well, why did he change it? No one else had changed it. Not that I know of. It would have been much easier and much more natural to simply stick with property. Why he changed it to pursuit of happiness, I don't have an answer. Arendt doesn't have an answer. I mean, she thinks it's indicative of an answer, or at least suggestive of one explanation, that in 2 years before he wrote Life, Liberty, and Public Happiness when he was writing the Virginia Convention. And she says that in the writings of the time, happiness was often referred to as public happiness. And so she thinks that there's clearly good historical, intellectual grounds for reading it that way. whether she's right or not, not only do I not know, I don't think anyone will ever know. I mean, how do we know what Thomas Jefferson was thinking or what those people were thinking? But I think she's using that to make an argument, and obviously it doesn't just depend on the words, right? It depends on the fact that uh, the founders were deeply committed to this Republican tradition that they helped to create, and she thinks they took it very seriously. On the other question about the freedom from want as one of the four freedoms, as opposed as let's take that as a statement of the private freedom, and public freedom as the freedom to participate. You characterized it as the public freedom as a freedom of a few top people. This is, of course, the critique of elitism. And I don't think that's a fair critique here at all. The premise of Arendt's work, right, is that everybody should have the right to participate in government, and that's why. And by the way, she'll talk about that a lot more in chapter 6, the last chapter. But the point is that she believes that the reason that public freedom became such a thing in America was because there was this tradition of town hall meetings in small towns across the country, especially in the Northeast and New England, but throughout the whole country, where people could and did put down their jobs and leave their families on a regular basis and go to a town hall and debate whether to hire a policeman or a teacher, or whether to build a schoolhouse or a firehouse, and that this was something that people did not just because it was a burden that they had to do, but because they enjoyed it and they loved it, and for her that's very important. In the end, one of her deepest criticisms of the American Constitution is that the only two levels of government that it recognizes are the national government and the states. And in chapter 6, you'll see she's going to say that this was the greatest failing of the American Constitution, in that it didn't represent and it didn't institutionalize a role for more local, federal and non-state institutions of public participation. So I don't think so. I think if you understand that, the elitism argument goes away, or at least is ameliorated in quite a strong way. All right, Steve.
Thank you, Roger. I've got two things. I'd offer something to the group about reading Hannah Arendt, which I'm not, and that is, she might be writing in English, but she's thinking like a German, because the German sentence structure, subject, a bunch of stuff, and verb. So if you find her subject, identify the predicate, and then you can sort out what's in between, because it's either going to be some kind of modifier or parenthetical. And that's the way I get through it. And my previous job was readability. Sure. So I just love this. But my question is this: going back to the colleague who asked about about occupying land, stealing it from the indigenous inhabitants. So that would suggest the question: would Arendt consider conquest of this sort an apolitical action? Because I'm not sure I agree with Clausewitz, who says war is continuation of politics. War or conquest is what happens when politics either fails or the more powerful side decides not to engage. And so what would Hannah Arendt say about that?
Thanks, Steve. It's a complicated question. I mean, she agrees with Clausewitz, right? She says that Clausewitz is right, that war is politics by other means, and that war is deeply embedded in human history. Because there are certain issues in human history that are not solvable through politics. And because there are issues that we can't solve through politics, the traditional human response has been war. Now, Clausewitz says war is politics by other means. I'm not sure Arendt would go so far as saying that it's politics. I think she sees war as the safety valve for the failure of politics. The problem this leads to for Arendt is a modern problem, right? Which is that with the advent of modern technology and with the advent of the rise of total war, starting with World War I and certainly leading to World War II and all future wars, what she says is that war has become so profoundly destructive that there's nothing that can justify war anymore. And so we now find ourselves in a situation where the safety valve for the failure of politics, war, has become almost off the table. I mean, it's so rare, and even when it happens, we try and prevent it from finishing, and then we don't solve political problems. And I think the obvious illustration of this is what's been happening in the Middle East for the last 70 years, right? The consequences of an all-out war would be so devastating and genocidal that we have prevented an all-out war for 70 years. And for good reasons. And yet the result is that the problem, which seems not to be able to be solved politically, never gets solved. And that's one of the tragedies of the modern era, in her words. So, your actual question that you asked is whether conquest is apolitical, is one I'm not sure. I think, like I said, for Clausewitz, it would be political, but politics by other means. For Arendt, yeah, I would think it's apolitical, and yet it's human. As much as I can answer that. So I'm not sure that's satisfying, but
it will do. And so I could follow up. You got another.
Yeah, let me take the other questions just to try and get them in, and you can always ask me somewhere else if you don't mind. Max.
Well, I wanted to start with the tip of the hat to Michael. I was a civil rights attorney myself, and I retired in order to homeschool my 5 young children. So I was thinking about how much fire Arendt took in chapter 2 on the social question, and I kept coming back to this sentence at the bottom of my page 130, which is in the book that I was issued. And it says, "And while it is true that freedom can only come to those whose needs have been fulfilled, it is equally true that it will escape those who are bent upon living for their desires, living for their desires." And I wonder if, I kind of wish she had maybe said that and made more of it in chapter 2. But I wonder if if what she's getting at is that our physical desires, our material desires and such, need to be oriented toward freedom, meaning they need to be focused on to the extent that they are the necessary precondition, what she calls the pre-political condition for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And that that means to be a distinction between, I suppose, how she characterizes some of the thought in the French Revolution, distinction from fulfilling needs and then ultimately desires for their own sake. And I emphasized when I was reading, bent upon living for their desires.
Yeah.
Because needs once met inspire more needs.
Yeah, well,
Or at
that's
least the perception of more needs.
Yeah, that's
Which
the
is sort of
problem.
engine of consumerism. Is that
Right. That's the problem with consumerism. And she says the great mistake that Marx, well, one of the great mistakes that Marx made in her view, which she explains in the chapter on consumption and the human condition, is that he didn't realize, he thought that once people's needs would be met, they would, you know, be content to take up hobbies and do other things. And it turns out that's not the case, that once people's needs are met, they want to consume more and have more needs. And so you know, that's the problem with capitalism, but also with communism, from her point of view. And so for her, that it's important to provide institutions where people experience the joy and happiness of public life, so that they are aware of something besides consumption that they should strive to and dedicate their lives to. And it's the absence of those institutions in American life that she feels and worries is the great danger that we confront. Okay. Yeah. Last question for Beatrice. Beatrice, are you there? I don't know. Are you there?
You need to unmute.
You're on mute, Beatrice. I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Maybe not. It's not working.
Beatrice, if you want to type your question into the chat quickly, you could try doing that.
Is there a way to unmute her? No.
Jess could unmute her.
No, I can only ask, which I've tried.
Yeah, I don't know. I've tried to. I don't know why it's not working. Well, all right. We're gonna have to end it there. I'm sorry, Beatrice. Maybe you can write me your question or ask it next time. I apologize. I don't know what's wrong with the system, but thank you all very much. I look forward to seeing you next week for, in my view, my favorite chapter, maybe in all of Arendt, Foundation 1, Constitutio Libertatis. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.